All right, today decided to be brave and hit some new waters here. There's a lot of debate about trace elements out there. People have all kinds of different opinions.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you all the mistakes that we have made, all the fails, all the different ways that you don't have to fail the same way that we have over the last decade. Learn from us so you can evolve your own tank and have more success. So today, the top 20 fails with trace elements. All right, so number one, probably the most definitive thing I'm going to say all day.
Don't assume or make the mistake of assuming that trace elements have zero or no value whatsoever. I've seen it before, seen people post their tanks. My tank is awesome. Never dosed trace elements before. You don't need them, they don't do anything.
Super easy to come to that conclusion based on what you just said. However, if you're going to say and share this with other people that trace elements have no value in my tank, you simply don't understand coral, animal, or plant biology. It's simply just not true. All right, so all of these elements play a role in the metabolic health and function of the animal, the rate of photosynthesis, energy production, just like vitamins and minerals do in your own body. All of these things are controlling the rates of different metabolic functions. It's super, super important. Now here's the catch, right? There's just a really big chasm between best practices and dead. This is not actually our bar of success, right? We're looking for best practices, or most of us are. So this is what we're going to find out today, and you're going to see a lot of ways to manage trace elements that will result in benefits for your tank. All right, so number two, kind of the inverse of that conversation.
Yeah, that's making the mistake of waiting for miracles. So I grabbed this bottle of trace elements. You told me to dose it like this. I've been dosing it steady for a long time. My tank just still looks like garbage.
Yeah, so if your tank looks like garbage, trace elements isn't your problem.
That's
right?
true.
This is going to be incremental results. This is the type of thing, like the progress left on the table, the coloration you're looking for, the growth and general health, the a resistance to other stresses of temperature or pH or anything else in the tank, the ability to withstand that type of thing, energy production, the ability to fight off parasites, all kinds of things, just general healthy organism. That is what we're looking for when we're looking for these. Only the worst possible depletion, I just never cared at all, is going to result in actual mortality.
Yeah.
So if your tank looks like crap, this is probably not going to be the solve of the problem. But what we're going to do is go from good to great. All right, so number three is got to be the biggest barrier I see all the time to find that progress on the table.
Yeah, so the mistake is having that mindset of survival is the goal. Survival is the bar that we set, success on, when we should be and we can do better for our animals.
Yeah, if it was my dog and my only bar for its health was whether or not it was alive or not, probably not good enough.
Probably wouldn't have the dog very much.
And if the only reason I could recognize that it was sick is because I brought it to the vet and the tissue was falling off of its skeleton, that's probably too late.
Yeah.
So we got to raise our game. We have to find out, learn what good health looks like for the coral before it's losing tissue. Share that information with other people and raise the bar. It's not just survival. It's actually thriving organism, making sure that the tank and the corals and everything in there can survive all kinds of ups and downs and care for the animals to the best of our ability. And so this one actually applies to a lot of things, but also trace elements.
Yeah, so the mistake is mistakenly focusing on what lived in my tank rather than what actually died. And a lot of us have, come across or you've had corals that die. I think a lot that leads to this mentality is corals regenerate and we can propagate them and we can frag them. And so if a couple die, but we can actually do better than it. Probably didn't have to die in the first place.
So here's really the number one thing for me is I can see a tank that looks awesome. It's filled with coral. It would look like everything is a success. But sometimes it's actually just a product of attrition, right? So actually double that amount of coral went in this tank. Half of them died. These are just what survived.
Oh, wow.
So here's the thing, going forward, if I want to find that progress on the table, I want to learn how to do this better, and I want to share this information with other people, I actually need to not find out why these things lived. I need to find out why those things died and then solve that. That is where the best path lays and how we can actually up the game for the entire hobby. And part of that is providing the nutritional elements that regulate metabolic function that we all know exist. Every biologist or marine biologist out there will tell you for sure that these things are important, and maintaining them will produce results. All right, so number 5, there's actually a range to do this in too. It's not one size fits all.
Yeah, so the mistake is not making a decision on what best means to you. So does best mean the wall-to-wall, I've never lost a coral, I've got these awesome colors. Does best mean, I've got a handful of them. I may have lost a few along the way. They look okay, but I'm happy nothing's dying, or something else, or in between.
So for a lot of people, best means manageable
Yeah.
or affordable, right? So you need to make that decision for yourself. Now, there's a lot of different spectrums out there. So, a lot of people feel like the Triton is the best. This option, manages trace elements specific to refugiums, replaces a lot of those elements, then gives you testing that actually backs it up. And then for the things that are depleted, you can dose that specific thing. However, that kind of best is not cheap, and it requires a little bit more work.
Yeah, true.
Another end of the spectrum of best is I will add some A and K to my bulk 2 part for the cost of a couple bucks, and know that I'm replacing trace elements. Not perfect, but it's affordable and easy to do, and for me, that might be best. Number 6, this wasn't actually super prevalent when I started, but most people understand it now.
Yeah, the mistake is missing that elements or certain trace elements can actually change or bring out some coral colors, in which case there are coral color specific products that'll tell you what colors that they're actually going to target.
Yeah, so a lot of these elements will actually generate color pigment production, or even sometimes fluorescent pigment production. And the beauty of it is they actually say that on the bottle, which means I can now have a standard, and I can judge it, whether or not it's worth my time.
Right.
So if I use this and it produces the coloration that I want, I'll continue using it. If it doesn't, I can stop because it's not producing the desired result for the amount of investment I'm putting into it.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things, like this system here from KZ, this is actually clearly labeled coloring agent number 1, 2, 4, and even amino acids here. So this approach here is to provide the nutrition and elements for corals to grow. It will explicitly state on the bottle what it's going to do.
Blues, pinks, yeah.
Follow it, and with what type of coral it's going to do it with. So that type of definitive information not only is helpful, but it allows you to judge the product based on actual merits and then decide if you want to use it continuously. All right, so number 7, this has actually become a fairly big problem in recent years.
Yeah, the mistake is chasing numbers, and now that we have tools available to us to actually get a number where some of these trace elements and their concentration in the water, that kind of leads people to, well, now I got to focus for a very specific number, and it's a mistake.
Yeah, you end up just adding bottles of this and bottles of that, and that is actually more risky and dangerous to the health of the animals than actually sometimes being depleted, because you're just dumping things in randomly, and the test kits aren't perfect.
Yeah.
So if I'm looking at 7 parts per billion and I'm trying to hit 8, I could overshoot it, or even it could be way off to begin with. So really think about how much effort you want to put into this, but don't go chasing numbers, trying to correct it, sending in test kit after test kit after test kit, trying to get perfection, because you're probably more likely to get a diminished result than increased. Number 8 is something that I used to say all the time, and I've kind of changed my mind about a little bit.
Yeah, the mistake is dosing stuff that you cannot test for, dosing elements you can't test for. It was a big prominent problem back in the day because there was really no test kits for these, or ones that you could accurately rely on. But now those tools are available, and so has that changed your mind?
Well, here's the thing. My mentors at the time told me, A, that trace elements weren't super important. You could do it with water changes, and it seemed largely true at the time.
Yeah.
And B, that dosing all these trace element elixirs, magic bottles, were actually more risky than anything because you don't even know what your levels are at.
True.
Which I bought into 100%. I now know more about the biology of not just the animal, but actually the photosynthetic algae that lives within it as well, to know that depleted elements is absolutely going to affect the health of the organism. But I still believe dumping in magic elixir all day long is also a risk. So that's where the ICP came in. And so now I have a window into whether or not I'm doing this correctly and whether or not any of these products are actually helping or hurting in my attempt to maintain, a natural chemistry. I don't need to get perfect natural seawater, but just to make sure that rather than having 5 parts per billion, that I don't have 0 or 45. Number 9, though, also big problem.
Yeah.
If you can read it, it must be true, right?
Yeah, this is making the mistake that assuming this ICP or any ICP is the law, and no matter what, you have to abide by it because it is the best test kit that we've had in the hobby for a long time, but it's still fallible.
There's something about a piece of paper and a number attached to it that says that must be accurate. I don't know. It's not true. And so specifically with the higher range, like the calciums, like they are actually off by as much as 10%. 10% means if it's 420, it could be 380 or it could be 460. It's a pretty big window.
Yeah.
It's a better tool for measuring the things you don't have ability to measure more accurately using test kits. So in this case, just because it's an expensive machine doesn't mean it's the most accurate. It means you can test things you could never test for before. Yeah. And here's the other piece of this, is if I were to pay to get a laboratory study done on some samples, they would actually only read into the parts per million in many cases, not billion like some of this. And what we're doing is actually making estimates, using algorithms to get down even deeper than many scientists would be comfortable sharing with. But it gives us a window into things that we don't have a window into, and it's better than no knowledge at all. So when we're doing the ICP test kits, don't think just because there's a number attached to it that it is the law, it's for sure the most accurate thing. It's actually just a window into the chemistry of our tank. And what we're really looking for is sustained rhythms within the tank and understanding the overall chemistry, not trying to use it as an absolute tool. Number 10 is actually just a different way of saying something we've already said, but it's worth saying again. Yeah,
the mistake is playing mad scientist. So you've got the test kits that can measure down there. You've got the information. You have the bottles available to you, individual elements that you can dose to the tank to make minor corrections and tweaks, and then you get wrapped up in all of that.
It gets so easy, just trying to follow every little bit of advice from my ACP report. Then I want to send it another one to make sure that it actually worked. Then 2 more things are off, and then before I know, I'm just dumping everything under the sun in there. That is not the intended focus, right? So don't be mad scientists. Just make sure that you're correcting the things that are farthest out of whack, and you'll have better luck with your tank. Number 11 might be for a while, but not always.
Yeah, the mistake here is assuming that water changes are good enough, and water changes is all I need for trace elements. It might get you to a certain point, but will it last 5, 10 plus years?
So I think the word in that is actually good enough.
Yeah.
Is it good enough? Maybe, but that's far from best practices. And it's also really dependent on what's in your tank. So if I have a bunch of zoanthids and softies in the tank, some of these things are actually only getting depleted at a certain rate. But even with the softies and zoanthids, there's a difference between having 5 polyps and 642, right? They uptake these things much faster. So basically what's happening when you're doing a water change is, you're depleting it, and you're bumping it up just a little bit. You're depleting it, you're bumping it up, depleting it. And so, well, it might actually look after a year like, oh, this water change thing is working for me.
Yeah.
You just haven't hit the point at which this doesn't work anymore. But because it's worked for a year or two, it seems like, this is the method.
Yeah.
But that's the biggest problem, actually, is what works for the first couple of years might not actually work later on. So have the flexibility in your mindset to understand that it's getting depleted in a seesaw effect, and eventually it might not work. Number 12, I think this is something that most people think. It's just not true.
Yeah, and that's assuming that all salt mixes have all the trace elements, And most salt mixes, you can just read the label and it'll tell you whether it has XXXXX or all of the elements for seawater or the important ones.
Yeah, it's like the devil's in the details here, right? So some of the better ones will explicitly state contains all 96 elements in seawater, or whatever number that is. The other ones will say contains all important elements.
Yep.
What does important mean? It means whatever it means to them at the time. And typically that type of phrase is attached to the least expensive options, which actually makes a lot of sense. So when you're looking at these things and you're thinking about using a salt or water change for partial replenishment or at least managed depletion of trace elements, it actually has to have them to begin with,
right.
To do that. So, read the actual bucket. Look for the misleading words on there. If it isn't definitive and misleading, it probably isn't the best solution. All right, so number 13, this is actually something that in the last couple months actually really came to mind for me. We already talked about it a little bit, but I'm gonna share a little bit more.
Yeah, the mistake here is assuming that what got you to 1 to 2 years is going to be the solution for 3 years and beyond, and water changes was one of them. It may work for the first 2 years. Now here we sit at 3 years, and I've got this illustrious tank. I've got all these corals. My tank looks awesome. When does that stop working?
Yeah, really. Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it works forever. But you actually have to be open-minded to the path. It might have to change at some point.
Right.
The things that work in the initial stages may not work when the density of the animals and the uptake of elements changes. The tank has changed. Will you change along with it? Or do we just assume the things that got me here will take me the rest of the way? And this is actually where this came from for me, is talking to the team over at Tropic Marin when they told me, don't add the trace elements to the 2-part for the first year or so.
Yeah.
They're like, well, why? And they're like, because it's a waste of time and money. The water changes will actually work for the first year in most tanks, and it really doesn't worth it. And in fact, you might even be using those trace elements to feed pest organisms just as likely as the corals when you have very few corals in there. But when the tank is filled with corals and rapidly uptaking these elements, it's now time to replenish them. And that's the biggest thing here, actually, is the fact that most people would never think that. And it's so tragic because, well, if it got me to here, it must work.
Yeah.
You would never really think to change there until somebody gives you some information and says, the coral density definitely changed in this tank by 10x. Maybe my approach needs to change with it when it gets to 20. Number 14 is maybe the most logical thing that we'll say today, actually.
The mistake here is not matching your goal to your investment. So some trace elements approaches are multiple hundreds of dollars. Some trace element approaches are just a few bucks a month, in which case you should plan accordingly your reasonable expectation of what the goal is, depending on which one you're using.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. But if I'm going to expend a fortune on maintaining trace elements, I want an actual result. I want to be able to see the results in the tank, experience them. I want to be able to share that with others. However, if I don't have all that money and time, and I'm only dumping a few dollars of A and K, or I'm using something like a 2-part that includes those trace elements, like Brightwell's Reef code, which is I think the cheapest 2-part that does that we tested. Well, now my threshold's actually pretty low. Right? I'm just putting a few milliliters of this in there, add a few bucks. I now know I'm doing it better than I was doing it before. And I don't have really high expectations for the amount of return on investment here. So really have that expectation. Think about it beforehand, because if you got an investment in your tank with $5,000 worth of acrofrags in there that are all super LE, well, maybe the investment in doing this perfect is worth it, because you're really pouring your heart and soul in here. If there's a handful of zoanthids and a couple of mushrooms and some fish in there, maybe the $3 method is more appropriate. All right, so number 15, like you need to think about all of the uptake sources, not just the coral and fish.
Yeah, so don't make the mistake of not thinking about the Cheato uptake or the Cheatomorph uptake. There's some, like the Triton Core 7 here, that they do take that into account, and so they have extra elements for the Cheato uptake, or even like the Brightwell Cheato Grow. But you have to at least think about it.
So here's the thing. Most people wouldn't think about it,
Right.
But I'm intentionally rapidly growing Cheatomorpha, turf algae, or any type of algae, my refugium, algae scrubber, or algae reactor, trying to uptake elements out of the tank, being specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, but other elements come along with that,
Yeah.
right? And here's the fundamental problem in all this, is it's uptaking the zinc and the potassium, the molybdenum, and the iron. But it just so happens there's another element in the tank that really requires those. That's the zooxanthellae, the algae that lives within the coral. Also requires those things to thrive and provide energy and sources of nutrition for the coral that it hosts in. So when we strip all of that out using our algae reactors and don't replenish it, it's absolutely going to affect the health of the coral, probably more than all of the other trace elements out there, because I'm intentionally taking the things that I know full well are based on photosynthesis, because the algae in my reactor or refugium is sucking it all up. So there are a couple of different ways to do that. You could do ICP and you could do mad scientists a little bit. You could also just trust in things like the Core 7 here, which I still think mind-bogglingly is the only two-part, I guess four-part in this case, that actually manages to the fact that you have a refugium and adds extra of these to manage to that effect. So with the amount of refugiums out there, somebody else should do this by now. But also with Brightwell here, Brightwell allows you to do it independently. So if you're using basically any other two-part out there, this allows you to add these things, and you can either use an ICP test kit or maybe just test for a trace mineral, or I should say a precursor mineral, something that can actually track. Like you can get an iron test kit and find out at least that the iron's on. I'm probably not overdosing on a lot of this stuff.
Right.
Not 100% true, but at least a window into the amount that you're dosing. But replenishing in this case is actually really, really important for the health of the zooxanthellae, because you know you're stripping it out with the Cheatomorpha. Number 16, think about this in terms of not what I'm willing to do today, but what I'm willing to do for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so the mistake here is not matching the method or the approach that you use with the testing and your time that it takes to keep the method up.
Yeah, so two-part that has some trace elements in it already,
Does it for
I could
me.
do that. I think anybody can do that, right? Adding some A and some K to the bulk pharma, I can do that.
Yeah.
Sending in ICP test kits, I can actually do that, but will I?
I didn't.
Yeah, I don't know. I got really excited about it, and then I kind of fall off. So, but that's just me. For other people, decide who you are, the type of reefer you are, the level of precision that you're looking for, and then decide your best approach. And in the case of the Core 7, for me, actually what I liked about it the most was the fact that it did manage to the Cheatomorpha and the refugiums that I like to have. And I would just use it that way, skip the ICP in most cases, and not manage all the other elements. Just know that I'm doing this the best that I can. Number 17, you can kill stuff this way.
Yeah, the mistake is overdosing, not considering that overdosing could be just as bad as underdosing or not dosing at all, in which case, like you said, playing mad scientist or just blindly dosing trace elements could lead to toxic or poisoning your corals.
Yeah, just because 0 molybdenum is bad doesn't mean that 164 is good, right? So make sure that you're actually doing this somewhat intelligently. Put some effort into it. If you put even just the most minimal amount of effort into it, you'll probably produce a desired result. But this isn't horsepower or more iron, more better.
Yeah.
It's not going to produce that type of result. So some of these things are actually poison or toxic at certain levels. So make sure that you're looking for the right level, not more is better. Number 18, do your best to not do this.
Yeah, it's like buying the new iPhone every time it comes out. Don't chase the newest trend for your tank and swap over to one and swap over to another. Something new in trace elements or the dosing comes out almost every year, and you can just kind of hold back and let the pioneers go out.
Yeah, it's the trailblazers that get shot in the back. You find new lands before everybody else. Some of you, the rest of you are gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like this is your tank. You put a lot of heart and soul into it. Resist the temptation to chase the brand new approach that are out there. There are a lot of approaches that have been around for 3 decades and actually produce the desired results. You can't actually improve on perfection in some cases.
That's true.
If it's producing natural seawater levels and it's doing it inexpensively and easy, mission accomplished. I don't need a new method for that.
No.
I think the balling method and their approach to like the A and K and ability to scale it up and down, now combined with ICP to give a window into how that's working, is actually a pretty good example.
Yeah.
It's been around for 3 decades. People have been using it all over Europe and the United States for a long time. So don't chase the like brand new thing that's out there. Look at the things that produce results for people you trust and then apply that to your tank. All right, so number 19. Be aware, people rip off other people's success all the time.
Yeah, the mistake is thinking that a copy of some approach or method is as good or better than where it was copied from.
Yeah, it's just not true. What it means is, me too, give me some of that money.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So there are people out there that have now copied the Core 7 approach because it was clearly profitable for them. There's people that copied the KZ approach, or at least attempted to.
Right.
There's people that have copied the balling method, multiples, in fact.
Yeah.
But most of these things have even been around for 30 plus years, or they've been a revolutionary component of something brand new. The people that say me too in hopes of chasing all of that money generally haven't been the innovators, or they would have already done it. They're just trying to copy, most often not actually what's inside the box or bottle, just the packaging and the name. So just because it looks similar doesn't mean it is. All right, so number 20, a little bit of an answer to a question that a lot of people have been asking for a long time.
Mistaking that calcium reactors are actually a supplemental trace element method or approach, not the way you would think. So we did some ICP testing on some calcium reactor media. It does replace the phosphates and maybe a couple other ones.
Yeah, are you looking to replace phosphate? Because it will do that. It will also replace some things like strontium. However, here's the thing. It's only melting the coral skeleton. So like whatever's in the aragonite crystal that it created as its calcium carbonate skeletal structure will be in there.
Yep.
A little bit of magnesium, a little bit of a variety of elements, but it's going to miss a lot. Because all of the elements that are involved in regulating like metabolic function and the rate of protein production and energy production and how it builds a tissue and how it uses light and water to produce that energy, all of those things are actually in the tissue or in the zooxanthellae itself, and not in a dead coral skeleton.
Doesn't come on the media.
Or at least very little. It's according to our ICP tests on the effluent of our reactor.
Right.
So just note that the calcium reactor might replace some things, specifically the things that are bound up in the aragonite crystal, but not very many. All right, so if there's only one thing that you heard today, let it be this.
Yeah, for me that is, don't make the assumption that the ICP test is the law, and I mean, I see it all the time. My ICP is not like your ICP and this ICP. They are fallible test kits. They're better than what we've ever had before, but let's treat them as a new window into the information we didn't once have.
Yeah. For me, the number one thing that I would like to get across today is a giant chasm between dead and best practices. Let's find the equilibrium in between there, where the amount of effort and the amount of money helps us find the progress that's being left on the table. Because yesterday's practices, specifically the mentality of look what lived instead of look what died, and solving what's dying is actually the thing that's most important to me. Find that progress that's left on the table and progressing all of our hobbies together. All right, so if you learned something today about trace elements, you want to learn some more, we have our master series on trace elements. There are actually total elements inside of the tank. Already you can see sodium and chloride. You can't believe that we can talk about sodium and chloride for a half hour. Or even hydrogen and oxygen and pH for a half hour. There's so much more to learn. I'm almost done writing the calcium and magnesium and supersaturation of water. And right behind that is phosphorus and nitrogen. We're gonna learn so much more about the chemistry of our tanks. So check it out right here. Here's the playlist to Mastering Reef Tank Chemistry.